Hello and welcome to A Gypsy's Kiss, the vlog. I'm Shelley Carney.
And I'm Toby Eunice. Stick with us for a couple of seconds and we'll tell you why Fenn's poem is not the Rosetta Stone.
Okay, did you get that lower third on there?
Lower third, right on, I can do that.
Are we set?
Hang on, let me get that. Yeah, lower third is up, we are set.
All right, so Fenn's poem is not the Rosetta Stone. Well, that's kind of obvious, but I'm sure there's a reason you said that.
I did, and we're going to talk about that in a couple of seconds, but let's do some announcements first.
Okay.
So a couple of things. Number one, we are going to take questions at the end of the presentation, so hold your questions until then. We'll stay on as long as we can to answer all the questions that you have about this topic. Number two, Treasure 284, Treasure 2017-284 has not yet been recovered. We've had several people, including Tammy Mattis, Cindy Guess, and Alan Pop, who have told us that they've figured out the decoded, the encoded effort, but nobody, and we've had a couple of people get to the second stage where they go looking for the next set of clues, but we haven't had anybody let us know that the treasure has been recovered, so it's still out there.
So if you're traveling for Thanksgiving, you might want to head that way. Might still be there.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Okay, and we, at this time, we're still planning to live stream the book launch for Fenn's new book, and it's called what again? Once Upon a While?
Once Upon a While.
On November 2nd at 6 o'clock in the evening, local time.
Well, you know what? That's what Fenn told me in an exchange when we first started planning the streaming. Since then, Collected Works has been more reticent about discussing the time, but I assume that since the others have always started around 6 p.m., that this one will start around 6 p.m. I know that they're opening the doors around 4:30 to let people with their tickets and books in. You do have a ticket. I didn't require one because I'm working, but you do have a ticket and a book, and so you do have a seat.
Yeah.
And you do need a seat. I think there are 46, at last count, 46 seats available. You do need a ticket and a book to get in, and you can get the ticket and the book. They're the same. You get both for the same price. The cost of the book, $24.95, and you can get that by calling or emailing Collected Works Bookstore events, the events section at Collected Works Bookstore, and of course you can find that on their website.
Hi, Adam Foddy. How are you?
Hey, Adam.
Okay, so we get started.
Yeah. So my position on the matter, what I wanted to talk about is the difference in longevity between the poem and the treasure. And so I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about that. So let's go back to The Thrill of Chase in 2010. There's a chapter where Fenn talks about the bells that he's made out of bronze and that he's cast out of bronze himself. And then hidden in the mountains outside in the hills, he describes, rather than the mountains outside of Santa Fe. And for anyone, you know what, that's somebody telling us they were signed on. For anyone who's been to Santa Fe, you know that Santa Fe is not surrounded by mountains, immediately surrounded by mountains. It's surrounded by these desert high hills that in and of themselves are above 7,000 feet, but they're referred to as the hills of Santa Fe. So I imagine that's where he hid the bells. And then right after he makes this statement, it doesn't matter who you are, it only matters who they think you are. And I always wondered, who exactly is they? And we're going to talk about the they in, later on when we talk about Ptolemy. And he has this paragraph follows that quote. And the first part of it is about his bells, but then he says the Rosetta Stone was undiscovered for 2,000 years. And don't you just know that the guy who carved it is proud? It was actually 1,995 years between the time it was written and the time it was found. So let's talk a little bit about the Rosetta Stone. It's what's referred to as a stone stele. It's a stele. It's made of granite, a type of granite. At first it was thought to be made of sandstone, but it's not. It's a very durable granite, and very attractive granite once they cleaned it up. It was carved in 196 BCE, or about 200 years before the estimated birth of Christ. It was discovered in 1799, Common Era, by a French soldier. And the interesting story with that is the French soldier was digging in some rubble of a building that had been demolished with the expectation that another building would be built on the spot. And he discovered the stone, and the stone had been used as part of the structure of the building. It wasn't like the building had collapsed on this unique stone. It had actually been used indiscriminately, apparently, as part of the structure of the building.
Which was located where?
It was located in Rosetta, Egypt. It's pronounced, I can't pronounce it in Egyptian, but that's where it gets its name, Rosetta. It was the French name for that place in Egypt. On the Rosetta Stone, they discovered there were 3 different languages. The first was the Egyptian hieroglyphics, which are basically pictographs. Demotic script, which is a type of Egyptian that was developed by the Greeks when the Greeks, after Alexander the Great, were running Egypt. They used demotic, not demonic, but demotic script up in the northern half of Egypt to communicate with one another. And then it contained Greek. And the assumption that was made, the initial assumption that was made, was that it was the same verbiage, just in 3 different sets of script. And the key, eventually it became the key to decrypting hieroglyphics after it was discovered in the late 1700s. It was taken to France. Actually, it was presented to French scholars, and they started the process of decrypting it using the Greek, because although it was ancient Greek is still eminently decryptable even then. So they used that, and then the next step was to decrypt the desmotic script. And of course, they realized at that point this is the same verbiage. And then over the next 100 or so, 200 years actually, because I think it was finally finished in around 1960, the hieroglyphics were decrypted. And that was the basis, I'm sorry, no, that's by 1920. And that was the basis for the evolution of understanding the Egyptian hieroglyphics. So it was the Rosetta Stone in its entirety, and especially the ancient Greek, that was the key to decrypting, deciphering ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. And that's why when now we find something that's the key to something, it's referred to as the Rosetta Stone. So it has a really interesting history. It's been fought over. Eventually the British in the Napoleonic Wars raided various musea in France, and part of their acquisition was the Rosetta Stone. They returned it to England, and it still sits in the British Museum today. There's actually 2 versions of it, the original version, which is behind glass, and another one that's basically a very good copy that people can touch. That's made accessible to them. And there's a constant battle between the French, the Egyptians, and the British about where it belongs. The British at certain times have considered it, returning it to Egypt, but they actually haven't done that yet. So it has its own very interesting history, but you can understand why it lasted as long as it did, the 2,000 years that it did, because it lay hidden someplace. And more importantly, it used the Rosetta Stone of Rosetta Stones and Egyptian hieroglyphics. It is the key to Egyptian hieroglyphics. And what's interesting about it is Fenn makes a comment like, don't you think that guy would be proud? Nobody knows who actually wrote it. They assume it was one of the scribes in the court of Ptolemy, and Ptolemy V. I don't know how much you know about Egyptian history, but Alexander the Great conquered Egypt and didn't like the place. He wanted to go back to Greece. But in the process, he left one of his friends, Ptolemy I, as the king of Egypt. So he took over from the pharaohs about, I think it was like 400 years before the birth of Christ, BCE. And the Ptolemies, I'm not going to get this out. Ptolemaic period lasted for another 500 years. And Ptolemy V actually took reign as a child, but reigned through his adult life, and then I think was assassinated. But there's actually, you can find an English translation of the hieroglyphics online, and it's basically a kind of a speech that was written to praise Ptolemy. It's very interesting how it was written.
So
So if you're familiar to today's...
unlike I come not to praise Caesar.
Yeah, exactly.
They did.
Yeah, they
Came
did come to praise Ptolemy at that point.
So did you cover the they? So you said when we got to Ptolemy, you would cover the they.
Oh, the they. Who is it that Fenn was referring to? So as we look at it today, when we refer, if we were to refer to the they of the Rosetta Stone, the they would mostly be scholars. The average person doesn't necessarily have an interest in Ptolemaic history or the Ptolemaic period.
But we don't have a use for it.
Exactly. So the question then becomes, who was Fenn referring to when he used that word they? And I don't think it was they, humanity. I think it was a very specific group of people that people who leave writings as important as this behind expect. I don't think necessarily that the person who carved this at probably the request or demand of the king had any idea that it would have some value.
For all we knew, it was a punishment.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in the comments, he writes that there is a parchment version of this exact thing being made, and it was going to be, there were copies being made out of parchment, and they were going to be transmitted, spread all over the kingdom. So there's some interesting things, and so the question is, when Fenn refers to the they, I don't think he refers to generically humanity. I think he refers to the people who study antiquities and they discover, because what's going to happen is somebody's going to dig up that jar, whoever it is, take it into a scholar and ask for something, tell me something about this piece.
Right.
And it's that scholar that's going to say, wow, interesting. Bronze jar looks like it was cast in the... Actually, his castings look like they are much older than the current period, but he's going to come to some conclusions. I think that's the they that Fenn was referring to.
Being that he was eschewed by the archaeologists of his own time.
Anthropologist and archaeologist, yeah. So it may be, that may be part of it, that he wants to get, well, I don't want to say get back at them. But
over time,
as I
growing greatness,
As I discovered by doing this research, Fenn is far more aware of the longevity of physical things than of ideas.
Right.
Ideas are very malleable, and that's the problem that we face in all of this.
Okay.
So let's look at the life of the Fenn's treasure. First of all, it's in a bronze box, which has a long life. It doesn't rust. It contains precious metals. For the most part, they don't rust. The silver will tarnish, but they don't rust and oxidize. He has some long-lived precious and semi-precious stones in it. He's got the glass jar, which could eventually be broken, and then there are some things in the glass jar that are organic in nature, his hair and the paper, that don't have the durability and longevity of, say, the semi-precious stones. So they might disappear, as does the wood lining, because the wood lining of the box is also organic. So it's going to be eaten away by time and the elements and nature. And then, of course, he took all of that and he hid it in a special place. And we talked about this last week, one has to assume was the special place was some place that he could hide himself as well, because that was his plan. So it's very likely, we don't believe it's buried. He often says, he didn't say it was buried. He also says he doesn't say it was hidden, but he's very cautious to say it was not buried. And I think that's not because he doesn't want you to find it. I think he was trying to meet some legal standards by not having it buried. And we'll have another show on that. So it is likely in a location that protects it somewhat from not nature, but the elements. It's protected from wind and rain and snow to the extent that if the box is closed, and maybe he even sealed the box with wax, some of those interior stuff is still going to be there. Now, on the other hand, if he hid it in Yellowstone, and in 10 years we experience a massive volcanic eruption of the caldera that sits underneath of Yellowstone, here's the interesting thing. The majority of the treasure will survive. It's not going to survive in the way that makes it recognizable as part of the Fenn treasure, but because of the items that he hid in the treasure, it will survive in a changed form. It's kind of like matter cannot be created or destroyed. Well, most of the stuff that he hid in there can't be destroyed. It'll change form. It'll
Right.
melt those coins into one big lump, for example. It'll recast the gold nuggets. The stones will pretty much stay the same because they can tolerate a certain amount of heat. In an explosion, it's going to generate some heat, but not enough to start melting those stones. And if it did melt the stone, it's not going to dissipate them. It's not going to destroy them. They're just going to become, come out in another form. So the interesting thing about the life of Fenn's treasure is that it'll last a long time, although it may not last in the form that we're most familiar with.
Much like when he visited Pompeii and found the wine cask and was allowed to drink from it.
I don't remember what he thought of it.
Well, it wasn't very good, but
Yeah.
it was a big deal to just do
I
it.
opened a 12-year-old bottle of wine that I had been dragging around with me in it. And then I thought the 12 years was going to help it. It didn't.
No, not often.
So that's the treasure. The nice thing about the treasure is excuse me, the treasure is going to accommodate change.
Right.
Whether man-made or natural, the likelihood is that the treasure will survive, right? Isn't there a song?
We'll survive.
That's the treasure song. So that special place in which he hid the treasure is identified in the poem, right? The location is identified in the poem. The poem was encrypted by Fenn, and what I mean by encrypted is he took physical features in nature and he encrypted them into metaphors for those same physical features, where warm waters halt, canyon down, etc., etc. He also has recently mentioned, I don't remember him mentioning this before, say 2014 or 15, but recently he said a couple of times that we need to focus on a word that is key. Now, one has to question whether he's using that word key in the cryptological sense, that there is a word that will help you decrypt, because that's what you're going to have to do to find that treasure, decrypt this poem, the implication being that there is a key. Now, I want to be very clear. I don't believe the process is similar to the process we described in our show of a couple of weeks ago, where we made a literal translation between letter substitutions, encryption forms. I don't think it's like that. I think there's the clues in the poem, the 9 clues in the poem, are metaphors for something, that he encrypted them into that metaphor, and that there is a key word in the poem that helps you to decrypt the metaphors and decrypt them into the set of instructions that he gives us to find the treasure. It is our assumption that the instructions have to rely on natural features. That is, when he says warm waters halt, it is very unlikely that he's talking about anything man-made, that it is a metaphor for something that is naturally made, or or something that exists in nature. And the features are independent of a map. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. It is very likely that if you study maps enough, you will start recognizing some of these features. You can find Ojo Caliente on a map, and from there you can see if there's a canyon down, and you can start taking some of these metaphors and translating them into things on a map. While I think that's possible, I don't think that's the solution. I think that the solution is interpreting the first metaphor. He always says, you've got to know where warm waters halt. I believe that's true. I also believe that it's going to be very difficult to determine the validity of any clue that you've come to after warm waters halt unless you are boots on the ground. So you might be able to pinpoint where warm waters halt is, and you know how I feel about pinpointing warm waters halt. It has to be geographically exact. And then you have to be on the ground to be able to translate those natural features and compare them to the metaphors that he's written into the poem. Now, here's the problem with that strategy. The problem with that strategy is it doesn't accommodate the magnitude of change that we've experienced since humanity started recognizing itself in existence. That happened over 200,000 years ago. At the end of that period, that 200,000 year period of hunting and gathering, we started the agrarian period, and that started just before the birth of Christ, where we started making that transition into people who stayed in one place and grew crops. At the end of that period, there was approximate population of 200 million. At the end of the agrarian period, which lasted 1/10 of the time, instead of 200,000 years, it lasted 2,000 years. I'm sorry, that should be 20,000, not 200,000. 2,000 years. It ended around 1750, and the population was 4 times as large. So order of magnitude in time, right? But the population rose only 4 times. It happened again from 1750 to what I approximate as 1967. In 1967, I wrote an article for Gannett newspapers, and it was called The Information Revolution. And it was based upon a conclusion I had come to that 1967 was the start of the information age and the end of the industrial age. The industrial age had lasted approximately 200 years. Population grew between the end of the agrarian age and the end of the industrial age. Population grew 4 times. We were at 3.5 billion then. Since 1967, between the 50 years between 1967 and 2017, population has doubled to almost 7 billion. And scientists and people who study this research are calculating that population by the end of this decade is going to be over 10 billion. There's a point at which, along that growth in population, that we start competing for natural resources. And it can come in a variety of ways. It can come, everything, we were talking about this just before, where you said in the West, we've still got property on which we discuss whether or not our cows can feed on that land, right? That's the big discussion. One day we'll be discussing whether or not, and that's not that very far off, that in the near future, where we're going to be discussing whether or not we can feed and house people on that land. Now, you mentioned something that I thought was really interesting, and that was population growth in the Western versus the Eastern countries. Mm-hmm. And that is, population growth has slowed in most of the Western nations, but has not slowed in most of the Eastern nations. And there's always been a dichotomy of belief, position, and understanding between the East and the West. So it is very likely that between now and the end of this decade, there will be a war between West and East over resources, competition for natural resources. That additional growth will also result in additional environmental disasters, simply because of the population growth. Environmental disasters are primarily caused by humans. Natural disasters are natural: earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, tidal waves, hurricanes, etc., etc. The point that I'm trying to make is that Fenn's treasure can survive most of that. Right? Mm-hmm. Even if we are struck by an asteroid that is the size of the moon, effectively destroying the planet Earth, it is likely that although it's not in the same configuration, right, molecular configuration, Fenn's treasure will survive. The problem with this is that Fenn's poem is not atomic in nature. Right now, it's mostly electrons, except where it's printed in the book. It's an idea. It is not a thing. And unless it has an immense amount of value, say like the ideas originated by Albert Einstein, it has a hard time surviving. Ideas have the hardest time surviving, especially in a period where humans' biggest concern is not whether ideas survive, but whether they survive. And I think eventually that context, human survival will overwhelm from the bottom up. You know, the last ones to disappear, if you will, in terms of ideas. And I'm not saying this is going to happen, but there's a scale of ideas that will disappear. And on the low end of the scale is the song that I wrote when I was 16 called She Played Memories. Okay, that's down at the bottom. That will disappear first. And at the top is Einsteinian theory. Okay.
Okay.
So based on that, there's a context that goes from bottom to top of ideas that are going to disappear. So that means that Fenn's poem is not only not likely to accommodate all this change, it's going to be the first amongst the first sets of ideas that are lost, and the precursor, the prediction of the loss of that as an idea is how much it is debated, and I'm going to use a curse word here, but I guess I shouldn't because that's going to close our monetization, and ambiguated, right? The more it is discussed, the more likely, the less likely it will be disambiguated, and that it will get more confusing, and you see that a lot, and not criticizing them, you see that a lot in the forums today, where one idea starts changing so rapidly that by the end of the conversation, which is, you know, multiple pages, it is nowhere near what Fenn has written. Mm-hmm. And so I think it has the potential to be that. So based on all of that, it is my conclusion that Fenn's poem has a life of 25 to 30 years. And the difference between the 25 and the 30, and probably even the 20 and 30, is when Fenn passes. Because I think Fenn's passing is going to add to the energy in ambiguation. And it's going to disassemble much more rapidly. And then the idea will eventually be lost. The treasure will still exist. And when it is found, someone will determine where that, assuming it's not a natural disaster, someone will go try and find out who hid that treasure. But Fenn has often said it is just as likely that somebody in a future time is going to bump into it by accident. I believe the probability of that occurring is greater than 50%. I think it's greater than a 50-50 chance that someone will not find the treasure as a result of decrypting Fenn's poem, but as the result of being out in, quote, nature, unquote, and tripping over the box. Voila. I lose sleep over this stuff. I shouldn't lose sleep. We have some questions?
We have lots of questions. Are you done talking now?
I'm sure, yeah.
For the moment?
Let's go for about a half hour. That'll take us till 2 o'clock.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to recognize Brian Schultz for donating $10 to our Super Chat fund.
What?
Yeah.
I just started that this morning.
Good
Thank you,
stuff.
Brian.
Love the channel. Thank
wow.
you.
Thank you, Brian. That was very kind.
Yeah. So awesome. And, of course, we say hello to Adam Foddy, B. Cross, Fosselman, James Cruz, and Jimmy Fast, and Chris Bischoff. Bischoff. Spurious Effect. Damon Jacobs. Love the show. Thank you.
Thanks, Damon. Thanks for watching.
Okay, James Cruz has our first question.
Okay.
Do you suspect Fenn put the poem in his bronze jars also? Bronze jars. I think he means the bells.
The bells. Well, he did make some jars as well. James, I think it's perfectly possible. I think it is far more likely that he put his biography in. And the reason is because he imagined that the bells would be out there a long time, primarily for two reasons. Number one, he buried them. He says he buried them. He buried them deep. So that means there's a natural process that's going to have to help in recovering them. And secondly, the poem is not going to help anybody determine who cast that bronze jar, while his biography will be very clear about who cast that bronze jar.
And the man in the barn agrees with you on that. Let's see. Eric Schmidt.
Yes.
How about the date of the chest when it was made? Jeremy Milstead answers 1150 A.D.
Yeah, that's good. Well, that's what Fenn tells us. Fenn says it was manufactured, cast around 1150 A.D. And he's said on a number of times, based on what I assume is interpretation, at least assessment by academics, that it has a quote Roman-esque unquote style to it. So that's when it was. That's when it was first formed, first cast.
Eric Schmidt says exactly on the date, and that date is key. Fossilman123, do you think Forrest Fenn hid it in a national park?
I think it is just as likely that Forrest Fenn hid it in a national park as it is that he hid it outside of a national park. There's no reason for him not to. He knows that it could create, if the finder immediately announced the find and immediately announced that they found it in a national park, they create a set of problems for themselves. But I think what he's going to assume is that if he did hide it in a national park, he's going to assume that the finder will be smart enough not to say anything about where he or she found it, announce it. We all know that we want everybody to announce it if they find the treasure, but we also know that there's nothing that says you have to indicate where you found it. So I think it is just as probable that it's hidden in a national park as it is not hidden in a national park or a state park for that matter. And I think the assumption Fenn is making is that you and he, and I think he's already said as much, will keep the location of where the treasure was found to yourself. There is no requirement for you to tell anyone where the treasure was found. And here's my advice. If somebody asks, if you find the treasure and somebody says, where did you find it? Your answer should be where Fenn hid it.
And there's a whole conversation about how hot I am, and we're going to skip over that.
Hot. I know, I'm telling you, it's really rough work. I've got the lights, I've got Shelly. Okay. The air conditioning is off because it makes noise. It gets really warm over on this side.
And I'm still kind of moving through that. Let me see if I can... Didn't Fenn say 100 years? Life of the poem. Journeyman.
Yeah, but if I was Fenn, that's what I would say too. I think you have to look at it from a realistic perspective. I would say that if I was Fenn, I would say that it was 100 years so that people kept using the poem as the basis. Again, I don't think Fenn, here's where I don't want to offend him. I don't want to be offensive, and that is, I don't think he was interested in analyzing the potential growth of the population and the impact it would have on both nature and the environment to determine when the length. I think 100 years, when he says the poem will last 100 years, is good for 100 years. I think that's his desire, as opposed to a deep analysis of what it's going to be like by the end of this century. And the end of this century is not going to be pretty. I don't honestly want to be here.
You won't. Jeremy Milstead said, what are your thoughts on the thrill of the chase being a Rosetta Stone of sorts?
If you mean by the book, again, I don't think, I think Fenn is a relatively, and I don't want to sound offensive, I think he's a man of simple tastes. And I think he felt like he had a story to tell about his life, and he had some vignettes, if you will, that had already been written, and people were saying you should publish these things, and that gave him the basis not only to publish his memoir, but then to incorporate the treasure in the memoir. I keep going. The more research I do in this area, the more research we do in this area, I get back to the clues are in the poem, and the poem will get you to the treasure. And the key is in the poem, because that makes perfect cryptologic sense to me. And now, that doesn't mean it necessarily makes cryptologic sense to anybody else. But when you put it in that perspective, it makes perfect cryptologic sense to me.
Let's see, Eric Schmidt, don't you think it's more than a coincidence that chest was built And San Lazzaro was also built in 1150.
I I the I don't know. I mean, what I mean by that is it's certainly a rational coincidence, and it certainly made a coincidence by the fact that Fenn has connected the two pieces. So maybe here's what's interesting about that. He could have pulled items out of San Lazzaro and talks about items in San Lazzaro, such as clay, fully intact clay pots that, as Eric has indicated, were made around the mid 1100s by Native Americans, but may not have survived the length of time that Fenn needed it to survive. So perhaps he was looking for what Eric kind of intimates was a, quote, period piece, that period, but had a longer life. So you may be onto something there, Eric.
Brian Poepelman, I'm sorry, Poepelman, I'm going to go with the first one. Line 2 has 6 syllables. Line 3 has 7 syllables, and line 7 has 7 syllables, while all of the other lines have 8 syllables. What do you make of this?
So I did that analysis. The poetic structure that Fenn used, that was used by I forgot that guy that wrote Invictus. Both C.S. Lewis in Alice in Wonderland, the poetic structure that was used by C.S. Lewis that he refers to, and Invictus that he has referred to, is an 8 syllables per line rhythm. And so I noticed that early on that there were several lines in there that didn't have the 8 syllables, and I tried to put some. I spent about a month with it, way back when, in 2012. I tried to make something of it and couldn't put anything together. It just didn't work. As a matter of fact, some of that research is still on my blog someplace way back where. So,
okay.
So the answer to your question is, I tried but couldn't make anything of it.
Brian Schultz, I am curious what the interest in frogs is about. Gold frog in the treasure box, frogs on several of his bells. He said he likes frogs and that they were easy for him to make. I guess they just kind of came to him.
He liked the long appendages. He's always said he liked the long appendages. He likes frogs and dragonflies are his 2 favorite animal totems, I guess is the best way to describe them. I haven't done any research into what they mean, but if I did any research, I would look at what Native Americans, what symbolism both frogs and dragonflies had to Native Americans, and whether or not, I don't ever remember seeing a frog pictograph. I've seen Native American dragonflies, Native American in petroglyphs and pictographs. I don't remember seeing frogs. Frogs are amphibians. They're very durable animals. They cook up well. I don't know. So I hadn't...
Eat the frog.
Other than the fact that they tend to be his totem, I would assume there's some sort of Native American influence significance in either the frogs and or the dragonflies, both of which he indicates a favoritism for.
Seven Blade. Why are all these searchers looking in places that are already excluded by clues given by Fenn or not fitting the poem? It's so easy to justify things when you're out in the field. You're like, things that we would discount and say, no, it's not that. When we're here talking to you from our podium and we get out there and we're like, oh, maybe it is a tree. Or so you want to find it so badly that you'll make it fit no matter what you have to do. It's like getting that puzzle piece.
There's a phrase that describes that. Right. So there's a couple of things in my life as a documentarian. One of the things that we learned, and one of the things that I teach, and one of the things that I learned a long time ago, is that when you ask questions, you use the 5 W's: what, who, where, when.
Where, what, when, why.
No, but not why.
Oh, no.
And how. But you don't use why or why not. And the reason is it can be perceived as offensive. So when you use a why, it can be perceived as, well, why are you asking me why I'm searching in these areas? The answer to the question that you want the answer, the answer to the question, let's see, the question that you want an answer to is, what do searchers know about their solution that causes them to look in those areas? Because a why, asking them with a why, is not going to get that answer. Shelley is correct. Mm-hmm. The what is, we searchers, and I speak generically, I'm not saying this happens to everybody, have made our fantasy fit what Fenn has told us is his fantasy. So his metaphors have become our fantasies, and that's what happens. Why, I think, is a much harder thing to get to.
Okay, let's see. Chris Bischoff, do you think Forrest Fenn still has the original draft of the poem he wrote? I imagine and kept it with all of the things he put in the book, and they would have some sort of file, right?
Well, yeah, but Chris, he brings up an interesting question in the sense that the original draft, like all original drafts, has some value, and Fenn is the kind of guy that might do that very well. Mm. He's a handwriting kind of guy. I'm going to have to assume that the original draft, that there is an original draft that is other than electronic. I mean, I don't know whether or not he was computer savvy, obviously computer savvy enough to write emails now. So I'm going to assume there did exist a handwritten draft, and Fenn would be the kind of guy to keep that.
All right. Let's see. Could these clues be individual points on a map that are used to triangulate a position?
Yeah, that's actually, you must have seen our program, about 3-4 weeks ago? Mm-hmm. We think that's possible, but again, the more analysis that we do, we come up with variations of that theme. We think it's possible because it meets the same criteria as we talked today. It relies on the existence of natural features. Those natural features could be used to triangulate a location, but they have the same limited life. So, and that's why we're very careful not to say these are directions that can be transcribed to a map by just drawing lines on the map. We think you have to be boots on the ground to determine whether or not what you've imagined these clues, the metaphors are, whether or not they're represented by natural features in that location.
Okay. Byron Bailey, do you have any indication from his last book signing talk to the latest book from his friend that some clues would be revealed upon his death, maybe the 10th clue? I'm not quite sure, but whatever conversations I've had with Fenn,
he's always reinforced there are 9 clues. The 9 clues are in the poem. That no one else knows what the 9 clues represent except him, and perhaps people that are dead, because you can keep a secret.
Right. We talked about
people
that last week.
Keep a secret. So I can say that based on my conversations with him, I don't have any sense that someday there's going to be an additional clue. I think, so this is my opinion, to believe that Fenn wants this treasure found in his lifetime or soon after his death, I think is a folly. I think when Fenn says he'd like it to last 1,000 years, I firmly believe that's how he hid this treasure and encrypted the poem.
Let's see. What are your thoughts about a color wheel theory? Color wheel.
I've seen the theory, and it is possible because it is influenced by his relationship with so many artists, including Eric Sloane. And Sloane was a master, not the, a master of the color wheel. I don't know. I can't give you a credible answer only because, although I've heard about the theory, I haven't done any research into it. You know, my answer to those questions is it's just as plausible as any other theory because nobody's found the treasure yet.
Mr. G, it's not really a question, it's more of a statement. I heard in one interview, and this was the only time, Fenn said that he hid the treasure 15 years after he got cancer, which was in 1988. Do you know what interview that was?
Yes, it was in the Moby Dickens interview, which you can find on our channel. I was there when he said it. I was recording the event when he said it. I nearly had a heart attack, and I was going to go ask him about it, but he was surrounded by all the people. This happened at the Moby Dickens bookstore, which is no longer active, in Taos, New Mexico, and he was just, it was upon the release of Too Far to Walk, and he had made arrangements. Dorothy was there. Jay and Carolyn, the owners of the books that Moby Dickens, were there. There were a couple of well-known searchers. What's the woman? Katya was there. And at some point, he made that statement, and I was behind my camera at the time, and I made a mental note of it, did the same calculation that you're doing now, and that is, wait a minute, that doesn't work out. He hid the treasure 15 years after he got cancer, 1988 plus 15, 2003. As you know, if you've looked at any of our other videos, you know I think that's perfectly plausible because it fits with other timelines. He still had an aircraft in that period of time. He still could have traveled back and forth in that time. He describes traveling back and forth in that time. So, yeah, I was very curious. I think there was one other time when he said it. I don't remember. The one that's most visible to me was Moby Dickens because I was there. I was recording it. It's my video that you're going to go to look at that 45 minutes. That's where he said it.
Okay. Let's see.
And I think Dale has a transcript someplace of our video. So you can look at the transcript and just do a search on that. I think terryscant.com has a transcript. So you can look at it. You can look for it there, do a search for it there.
Sea monkeyfication. Fenn has described the chest as both Romanesque and in one other interview, Flemish. Why do you think this is?
Because the Roman area of influence during that period had spread literally all over Western Europe, and it could very well have been done in the area that we now know as Belgium, which is Flemish, but it would have been controlled by the Romans and influenced by Roman art and architecture. So I've never heard that statement. I'll check it out if he's referred to it that way. But because of that period and the Roman Empire's influence on Western Europe in that period, it is very plausible that it could be both Romanesque and cast in what we now, I don't think it was Belgium then, I think it was Gaul, right? What we now know as Belgium.
Yeah. Okay.
Whew, tough questions today, huh?
Jimmy Fast says, nothing destroys a good solve like having boots on the ground. Yeah. You're right.
Yep.
But you got to come back for that.
As I've discovered 27 times now.
And Eric Schmidt confirms that Moby Dickens is the answer to that.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's see. Mr. G, do you think he deliberately gives false dates because of the ease of information searching on the net these days?
I don't think he gives out anything false intentionally. I think when he gives out something that is not accurate, say, for example, the 15 years between the time he got cancer and the time he hid the treasure, I conclude that it's one of two things. Either that's what happened, or he just isn't doing the calculation in his 86-year-old head correctly. And that's very possible. As we get older, we get, our capacity diminishes. There's no stretch. There is nothing that tells me that Fenn, is Alzheimer-ish, if you will. No. He still seems to be very sharp, very bright. Mm-hmm. But like all of us, as you tell these stories, and Shelley will help you, confirm this, she has to remind me of stories that I've told her so that I don't confuse them. and dates and things like that. So, and I'm 68. So I'm sure for an 85-year-old guy, it is more difficult. I don't think he does. I don't think he does or does not do clues intentionally or hints. I think he does them accidentally, or he just forgets that's when it happened. You know, that's why I took what was interesting about the 15 years between 1988 and 2003. That was completely initiated. No one asked him a question about that. They asked him about his health, and he volunteered that data. So to me, that was something that was stuck in his head, and that's why it became so important to me. Although he still denies it. He still uses the 2009, 2010 dates, 79 to 80. But
Oh, okay. Um, okay, so I know you've answered this before, but what is the blaze?
okay, so in a metaphorical sense, the blaze is what you're going to see before you look down at the treasure. The blaze is some sort of marking, because that's how you define blaze. There are indications in some of Fenn's words that the blaze is white. We believe it has a geologic interpretation. So, for example, the blaze could be a strain. What do they call it?
Striation?
A striation. But when they say there's a gold vein. So in our opinion, the blaze is a white quartz vein in some sort of geologic formation. Now, that's one side. The other side is when you start thinking about Fenn and the way he sees things, the blaze could just as easily be a once carved petroglyph or pictogram, Native American petroglyph or pictogram that indicates a place of ceremonial or religious significance for the Native Americans. So those are the two options, geologic or man-made. Geologic is probably, we think, white quartz in a much greater area. And then man-made is something Native American that indicates the location of some place with spiritual, religious significance for them. We look for both, by the way.
Sorry, it keeps bouncing around. This is from Eric Schmidt, would you consider Forrest Fenn somewhat of an expert on Pueblo pottery?
Oh, good question. I don't know that he's done necessarily an in-depth research. He's certainly more of an expert than your man on the street as a result of the research in combination with several scholars that he did at San Lazaro, where they would have to compare it with other Pueblo tribes' products. I wouldn't call him an expert. I would call him a highly knowledgeable amateur. How's that?
Okay, I think that's going to be it for today.
Okay, wow, that was good. I like that.
6 minutes away from an hour, and everything is kind of getting off track, and it's not really.
Right, see, didn't I predict that?
Yeah.
So the longer an idea stays out in the public domain, the more ambiguous the idea becomes as a result of discussion and debate.
Completely off topic.
Yeah, by the time you see it, it's completely off topic.
Telephone, right. Okay. So what are we talking about next week?
Next week, we are going to talk about...
Oh, did you give them the recommendation?
Oh.
Wrap-up recommendation?
Wrap-up recommendation. I didn't write it. So my wrap-up recommendation is spend the next winter, the coming winter of 2017 and 2018, determining what the key word in the poem is, then decrypt the poem and find that treasure next summer. That's our plan. And the reason is eventually the ambiguity about that poem is going to increase, and it's going to automatically increase by an order of magnitude upon Fenn's passing. So the sooner, and that's not a wish, that's not a desire, I'm just stating a fact. So the sooner you find that treasure, the sooner you find that treasure.
Okay. And
Okay.
the whole world finds it as well.
Exactly.
Okay. So next week.
Next week we're going to talk about our perceptions of what the state of the search, where it is. I have some
To New
comments.
Mexico.
No, the state. Oh, not that would be a capital
You mean
S.
the condition of?
The condition of the search as we see it, and some of the discussions that are occurring, and some things that I think I can, with confidence, shoot, some assumptions that have been made that I think I can comfortably shoot down.
All right. We did have one question about, is the book out? Is his new book out, and can we purchase it? It's not out yet. Is that correct?
It is not, it is still in production. They were supposed to deliver it yesterday, but you can call Collected Works bookstore, give them your credit card number, and order it and pay shipping to have it where you shipped. If you want, I don't know if there are any seats left, whether or not you can still buy a ticket, but with a book, you're entitled to one ticket if you plan to show up on November 2nd. I don't think, if they got them yesterday. That was the last date. I haven't checked on them today. We're supposed to talk to them this evening, as a matter of fact. So I'll ask then. If they don't have them, you can still call them to order the book, $24.95.
Right. Or they can email.
They can email, and I think it's events at CW Bookstore, if I remember correctly. I don't want to give it to you.
Okay.
Okay.
And that's it for today. So thank you all for joining us and for live chatting with us. And I hope that you can get some information out of this and some really good help for your solutions.
So this is a lot of fun for us. I've decided we're just going to keep doing this live stream thing instead of doing the production. We know the quality's a little bit off, but this is too much fun, and we feel like we can get a lot of information out there at once. So.
And thank you for coming to my defense in the chat, and I'll figure out how to ban people in the future so we don't have to worry about that.
What? Somebody was being offensive?
And somebody was being offensive. But
oh, yeah,
these
there's
guys
a way
came to my rescue, so
Thanks.
that's okay.
Good, okay.
But we'll fix that for next time. Thanks for tuning in. And for Gypsy's Kiss the Vlog, I'm Shelley Carney.
And I'm Toby Eunice. Thanks for watching. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye-bye.